Well, good evening, everybody. It's a great joy to have the Senate room with a goodly audience, and on this bright summer's evening, you probably all want to be outside than inside, but it's well worth stopping to celebrate yet another new professor being installed at the university. A warm welcome, everybody. Delighted again to see our Chair of Council with us, Canon Peter Wynne. Welcome, Peter. And some other colleagues and friends. I have guests of the university, Jacqueline Kuti, if she's here. Jacqueline, welcome. Jacqueline is the president of Initiative of Change Switzerland. Dr. Imad Karam was also here, Initiative of Change executive director. Welcome. And we have colleagues from the University of Chester and the University of Edge Hill who have worked as our colleagues with our professor tonight. So welcome. Welcome to Liverpool Hope and welcome to our Senate room. This is a very special room which the Senate sits in, one of our two chapels, and we make our most important academic decisions in this context. And we also use it for other special events like this one. Installing new professors, we don't do very easily at the university. We do them very carefully, and they're highly selected, and they're all research active and leading scholars in their field. And tonight we celebrate as a young scholar who actually grew up with the health sciences at this university, and with all the hoops scholars must jump these days, he successfully jumped those at this university. And I'm delighted, Simon. I remember you as a young lecturer and senior lecturer, and there you are now a personal chair in your field. So I'm delighted, ladies and gentlemen, to welcome you all to the university. And I'm going to ask the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research, Professor Atulya Naga, to introduce our professor this evening. Professor Naga.
May I just add my own welcome to that of the Vice Chancellor. It is always a great privilege to be asked to say a few words by way of introduction on these occasions. And as always, I am very pleased to have this opportunity tonight. It is a particular pleasure to do this evening, since Professor Marwood is not someone we have brought in from outside, but rather, as the Vice Chancellor mentioned in his opening remarks, someone who came to us as a postdoctoral teaching fellow and has earned his chair, has become a professor through the process of our own internal promotion. And I ought to say that the promotions process is a very rigorous one. It involves the submission of a substantial application which gives a clear evidence of a person operating at the highest levels in all three equally weighted areas of teaching, research, and wider contributions. There is certainly no compromise in standards. Professor Marwood has been given a personal chair as Professor of Exercise Physiology in the School of Health and Sport Sciences. Over the past several years, the university has been working hard to build up its provision in sciences, and indeed, a significant investment has gone into our laboratories and state-of-the-art research facilities, ranging from psychology laboratories, sports rehabilitation clinical facilities, biosciences, nutrition laboratories, robotics, electronics, and artificial intelligence laboratories. This indeed has helped facilitate interdisciplinary work in sciences with a recognition that the big challenges facing society will not be addressed or fixed by one discipline, one academic discipline, or one scientific method alone. These are big, complex questions, such as living with environmental change, global uncertainties and security, energy needs, lifelong health and well-being. This inaugural lecture of Professor Marwood is another important milestone on this journey. Professor Marwood obtained his doctoral degree from London South Bank University. Prior to that, he earned a first-class Bachelor of Science degree with honors in physical education and sports science from Loughborough University, and an MSc in exercise physiology with distinction from the same institution. He came to us in 2006, and as I mentioned earlier, as a postdoctoral teaching fellow in sport and human biology. Alongside teaching and research, he has contributed to a number of roles and responsibilities in the university, including as a postgraduate research moderator for our accredited partner institution, St. Mary's University in Twickenham. Currently, Professor Marwood is a subject lead for sport and exercise science and sport rehabilitation in the School of Health and Sport Sciences. And working very closely with me, Professor Marwood is also responsible for embedding research skills and inquiry in the wider research environment within this university. He is a fellow of the Higher Education Academy. His research expertise relates to skeletal muscle energetics, in particular kinetics of oxygen uptake and their relationship with critical power and fatigue, recovery from high-intensity exercise, and the competitive utilization of fat and carbohydrate with a particular interest in how the findings can be applied across both sporting and clinical populations. He is an advisory editor for the European Journal of Applied Physiology and an associate editor for another journal called Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise. He has previously held the position of Honorary Research Fellow at Aintree University Hospital. Away from academia, he has previously represented Great Britain as modern pentathlon. So he is a former international athlete, and I understand he remains a keen runner and sometime cyclist and a triathlete. So, an all-round scholar, colleague, and an athlete then, it is now a genuine delight and joy for me to ask Professor Marwood to step up to the lectern and deliver to us his inaugural lecture entitled Exercise Tolerance, Shaping Human Evolution, History and Culture. Professor Marwood.
Thank you. A long time ago, a GCSE in physical education was proposed. And in my school, we were the first year to whom it was offered to. And I distinctly remember one of my friend's parents saying to me that to take this GCSE in PE would be a waste of a GCSE. I hope by the end of this presentation, I've managed to persuade you that understanding sport and exercise has consequences for contemporary society, and that the ability to exercise has indeed shaped our evolution and history. Along the way, we will encounter 3 physiology lessons. For anyone that groaned, my first draft had 5 lessons. Well, my wife proofread it and gave me one of those looks. So now there are 3. Usain Bolt remains the fastest human to have ever lived, at least without mechanical or gravitational assist. For me, he is the greatest male sprinter of all time. And in this short clip, I think you'll find that Michael Johnson, also one of the greats, agrees.
Anybody do any damage to his chances tonight, this evening?
No, they can't. I mean, he's just a completely different athlete on a whole nother plane. We've never seen an athlete like him. There's no athlete out there that can compete with him. It's just not possible.
And Colin, here we go. Your money's clearly on Bolt. Will he break the world record? That's the point.
I think he will miss it.
The 200-meter final.
Set.
Away cleanly. Bolt has got a very good start indeed. Flies past Alonso Edward on the outside of him. Has had an excellent bend. Sean Crawford going well out in lane 8 as well. But it's all about Usain Bolt. 2 meters clear, 3 meters clear, 5 meters clear, and away he goes. He continues on his way towards another gold medal. Watch the clock this time. I cannot believe it. A fantastic 5. 5 gold medals, 5 world records. 19.2, you've got to be kidding me.
Away first time, good start from Bolt. Bolt leading a moment and going away. Gay trying to go with him and he's being dragged through to second place, but he's going to win it by 2 meters. 9.58, the world record's gone.
Bolt's records, which still stand, are 9.58 and 19.19 seconds for the 100 metres and 200 metres respectively. During the 100-metre world record, Bolt reached a peak speed between 60 and 80 metres of 44.7 kilometres per hour. Since my dad is in the audience, we best convert that to 27.8 miles per hour. However, the animal kingdom has got this covered. In captivity, the cheetah has been measured at 64 miles per hour, the greyhound, 39 miles per hour. Even the humble hippo can roll along at 30 miles per hour. Despite this, it is plausible that early humans were able to run down and capture prey of significant size, particularly 4-legged mammals we might generically term quadrupeds. Given the disparity in peak speed between these animals and humans, you might wonder how we were ever able to achieve this. However, in the South Kalahari Desert, modern hunter-gatherers, presumably using tactics similar to our human ancestors, have been documenting hunting and capturing large quadrupeds, such as this eland as shown here. However, these tactics don't relate to taking on the animal at peak speed. As we have seen, that is doomed to failure. Instead, the energetics and thermoregulatory requirements of very prolonged exercise are exploited. See, humans have an excellent mechanisms for losing body heat, and hence, on a hot day, even James Bond will sweat. However, most quadrupeds lack a sweating response, and hence, as any dog owner knows, on a hot day, their dog will pant. Here is Cooper. If in doubt, put a cute dog picture up. Tongue lolling out to try and expose as much of that tongue to the outside air as possible, rapidly exchanging air with the upper respiratory airways, and heat is lost by evaporation. This is panting. The problem for quadrupeds is that for their fastest form of locomotion, the gallop, the mechanics are such that panting is just not possible. And as a consequence, a prolonged gallop is simply not possible due to overheating. And hence, in considering how humans might have run down and captured large prey, an important metric to consider is what we call the trot-gallop transition. The trot-gallop transition speed represents, therefore, the upper limit of locomotion for these animals that can be sustained with any sort of effective body cooling. Now, amazingly, the trot-gallop transition speed has been measured on a whole range of animals. What you can see here is a plot of a range of different animals with body mass on the horizontal axis and the trot-gallop transition speed on the vertical axis. And on this plot, the relationship between body mass of the animal and their trot-gallop transition speed is remarkably linear across a whole range of quadrupeds, from the mouse to the dik-dik to the donkey. As a consequence, we're able to predict the trot-gallop transition speed of quadrupeds that we might conceive of our human ancestors capturing. So, for example, take the water buck at about 155 kilograms. That gives a trot-gallop transition speed of about 10 miles per hour. Now, that might seem a fast speed, but actually in the UK this year alone, over 2,500 people have run the half marathon at this speed or faster. Take the eland of about 250 kilograms, the eland we saw earlier. This gives a trot-gallop transition speed of around about 11 miles per hour, comfortably sustainable for about 30 minutes for many thousands of individuals in the UK. Now, just in case you don't think there's that much difference between 10 miles per hour and 11 miles per hour, tomorrow, go out and run as far as you can in an hour, and then go out the next day and run a mile further in the same duration. The reality of the hunt for such prey, as documented in 2001 from modern hunter-gatherers, is that the animal would gallop off and then be forced to rest in the shade to cool down. And this prolongs the hunt to a duration on the order of hours. And you can see this in this documentation here, with green indicating periods of running and red indicating periods of walking. Now, this particular hunt was unsuccessful. However, the average speed of this intermittent strategy of the animal is typically too slow to challenge the human's ability to regulate their body temperature and sustain this exercise, even across distances covered in, for example, this successful hunt on the right that was tracked with GPS transponders on the hunters. The distance covered, you can get some indication by on the scale on the lower right-hand side. And hence, despite significant imbalances in peak speed, the ability of humans to tolerate very prolonged exercise wins out. Central to our story, therefore, is understanding exercise intensity, which means it's time for our first physiology lesson. During exercise, the body strives to cover all the energy requirements of that exercise through processes we call oxidative metabolism. That is, metabolism that requires the presence of oxygen. Now, those extra requirements are all at the level of the individual cells, but we can easily measure the sum total of them by capturing expired air at the mouth and into a sealed plastic bag we call a Douglas bag, and analysing the contents, with the prime measure that we're looking at being oxygen uptake or oxygen consumption. And our students routinely do this in the laboratories, and it represents probably one of the most fundamental measures of human function. And yes, that is me, looking a bit younger. I'm on the left. For relatively low intensity exercise, once the exercise transition has been completed, all of our energy for movement comes from oxidative metabolism. And in such cases, oxygen uptake otherwise known as VO2, shown here on the vertical axis. It reaches a steady state, which occurs after just a few minutes of exercise, and this steady state is maintained thereafter. And we call this type of exercise moderate intensity exercise. However, if we increase the exercise intensity by enough, we can disrupt this pattern. Above a certain threshold of exercise intensity, the initial establishment of the steady state is disrupted after about 2 or 3 minutes by an additional oxygen cost that arises. Steady state is still achieved, but at a higher level than otherwise expected and taking significantly more time than normal. The consequences of this higher oxygen cost are excessive body heat storage and also more rapid depletion of our energy stores. Fatigue and therefore exercise intolerance occur more rapidly in this domain of exercise that we call the heavy domain of exercise. We can be fairly confident, therefore, that the hunter-gatherers of our ancestors and of today conduct their hunt for prey in this moderate domain where they, or us, are able to regulate or keep our body temperature under control, but the prey is not. And hence the capacity of our ancestors to tolerate such exercise in this domain, in a large part due to our superior thermoregulatory abilities, has had a powerful influence on our evolution and our development by allowing us access to rich sources of food, particularly fat and protein, that would otherwise have just been beyond our reach. In terms of this heavy domain of exercise, probably the most famous examples of the adverse consequences of prolonged exercise in this domain are Johnny Brownlee, the triathlete, being helped to the line by his brother Alistair. You can't see it in this light, but they are two very distinctly different shades of colour on their skin, with Johnny being basically grey. And also Alex Wyeth, here also being helped to the line. So Alex Wyeth, the Chorlton runner in the black vest, being helped to the line by a fellow competitor in the London Marathon. Both are suffering some combined consequences of extreme energy depletion and a form of heat injury consistent with very prolonged exercise in this heavy domain of exercise. The threshold separating the heavy from the moderate domain of exercise is the lactate threshold. It's perhaps unsurprising, therefore, that a key goal of endurance exercise training is to increase the lactate threshold such that increasingly higher exercise intensities are contained within this moderate domain. Whilst that might not be surprising, what is surprising is the keen sense of the lactate threshold that the Roman Empire and their military advisors seem to have. The writings of Vegetius from approximately 435 AD, translated here in his work, The Epitome of Military Science, indicate acute knowledge of human function and human exercise tolerance. Within this text, the requirements for marching legionaries were detailed. There was two possibilities. The full step, which was unladen, and the military step, whereby they were carrying approximately 43 pounds of weapons, armour, and rations. In what was described as 5 summer hours, legionaries were required to march either 24 miles at the full step or 20 miles at the military step. When corrected to modern-day metrics, this is equivalent to a speed of about 3.4 miles per hour for the full step and about 2.9 miles per hour for the military step. The late, great Brian Whipp, who was a pioneer in my research field of interest, undertook measurements of the energetic demands of these marching legionaries. They took males of approximately the same size of Roman legionaries and had them walk on a treadmill at the two respective speeds and with and without the carriage of appropriate weight. The oxygen cost of the exercise was measured. Two things stand out. Firstly, when you compare the required oxygen uptake of the unladen full step at 1.43 litres of oxygen per minute to the laden military step, which was 1.42 litres per minute. Essentially the same. And it's incredible to see how well the advisors to the Roman military were able to match the otherwise differing demands of laden and unladen marching so precisely by manipulating the required marching speed. The second notable feature is an apparent knowledge of the lactate threshold, the threshold beyond which very prolonged exercise on the order of many hours is simply not possible due to the heat storage and energy depletion. Let's add about 20% to these values to account for uneven ground and environmental conditions such as wind. That gives us a required oxygen cost of marching legionaries of about 1.7 litres of oxygen per minute. I'm going to correct that for the effective body mass, which gives us a required marching oxygen cost of 20 millilitres of oxygen for every kilogram of body mass per minute. Now, we have made many, many measurements of lactate threshold on ordinary young men in our laboratories over time. Here's just one set of data I'm going to show. Here, the lactate threshold was measured at 1.68 litres per minute, but these participants were a little smaller than our typical legionaries, and hence, when we correct out the lactate threshold of our completely ordinary people, we get a value of about 21 millilitres of oxygen per kilogram per minute. When you compare that to the required marching oxygen cost of just under that at 20 millilitres per kilogram per minute, you realize that the Roman Empire, or at least the advisors to the military, pushed the required marching speed to the very upper limit of the domain in which exercise on the order of hours was possible, just below that lactate threshold for the typical individual, and therefore presumably maximize marching performance. Just below the heavy domain of exercise, where prolonged exercise on the order of 5 hours, 5 summer hours, would simply be not possible due to the effects of heat accumulation and rapid energy depletion. On an individual basis, this is quite important because the punishment for failure to keep up with the required marching speed was death. And so, the writings of Vegetius and the success of the Roman Empire in dominating Europe, North Africa, Western Asia, demonstrates an early but keen sense of human physiology and the threshold of human physiology beyond which very prolonged exercise is not possible. And it's just one example of how humans' capacity to tolerate exercise has shaped the historical landscape. So when we compare or consider the ability of quadrupeds and humans to undertake exercise, it becomes quickly apparent that there exists a general inverse relationship between exercise intensity and exercise duration. Now, you might think that this relationship would be essentially linear, such that as the exercise intensity reduces, the capacity to tolerate that exercise increases proportionally. You'd be wrong. Here is some data collected from our laboratories on a well-trained triathlete. Here, quite simply, we took this participant into the laboratory on 4 separate occasions at 4 differing power outputs, and we just asked them to ride for as long as possible. And we measured the time that they took it. And so you can see that as the power output comes down, the capacity to tolerate exercise goes up. But this relationship is curvilinear, not linear, which means that when you reduce the exercise intensity, there is a disproportionately large increase in the capacity to tolerate that exercise. And indeed, in this particular example, if we reduced the exercise intensity from 400 watts by just 20%, that would result in a 400% in the capacity to tolerate that exercise. Now, we weren't the first, as you might expect, to describe this curvilinear relationship between exercise intensity and exercise duration. The Nobel Prize-winning physiologist Archibald Vivian Hill first described this in 1925 when he took the speeds of the then world records for swimming and running and plotted them against the time at which those world records were set. What you see, though, is that not only is the relationship between exercise intensity and exercise duration curvilinear for the individual, but if you take the best performances across a population, that curvilinear relationship is retained. And you can do that with present-day records. Here, for track distances between 800 meters and 10,000 meters, you can see the curvilinear relationship is retained, albeit at slightly higher speeds than in 1925. Significantly, this curvilinear relationship can be well described by a mathematical model that has an asymptote. An asymptote being a value that the curve approaches but never actually meets, as indicated by the dashed line. We call this critical power. And for this individual, it was 301 watts. Remarkably, critical power and this curvilinear relationship between exercise intensity and exercise duration appears to be preserved across the animal kingdom, having been described for the thoroughbred horse, the mouse, with the data in this particular example being linearized mathematically, and the lungless salamander, where you're just going to have to trust me. In understanding the significance of critical power and this curvilinear relationship between exercise intensity and exercise duration, we must return to the pattern of oxygen uptake in response to exercise of different intensities as described earlier, which means it's time for physiology lesson number 2. Previously we saw that for moderate exercise, that is below the lactate threshold, an early steady state for oxygen uptake was established. If we increased the exercise intensity above the lactate threshold, we entered the heavy domain of exercise, where a steady state was ultimately achieved, but it took much longer to do so and was at a value higher than you would otherwise expect. If we increase the exercise intensity above the critical power, by stark contrast, no steady state is achieved. Oxygen uptake rises inexorably toward maximum values, which we call the VO2 max. And in contrast to the heavy and the moderate domains where fatigue is caused predominantly by overheating and energy supply. Fatigue in this domain of exercise that we call the severe domain, fatigue is caused by factors emanating from the muscle that produce an uncontrollable fatigue that brings about exercise intolerance in short order. This uncontrollable fatigue is a consequence of the body or the muscle trying but failing to cover the demands of exercise via oxygen uptake. And hence, our two thresholds of critical power and of lactate threshold demarcate three domains of exercise intensity. The severe domain, dominated by the rapid, uncontrollable accumulation of fatiguing elements from the muscle. The heavy domain, this hinterland between the lactate threshold and critical power, with fatigue predominantly due to aspects of heat accumulation and energy supply. Despite this, exercise here remains tolerable on the order of 1 to 3 hours. In the moderate domain, below the lactate threshold, the rate of depletion of energy supplies and accumulation of body heat are far lower, and exercise can be undertaken for many hours as compared to the heavy domain. And hence, it is within the moderate domain that empires were formed and prey was hunted. What then is the significance of critical power to our society? Well, we see it in the range of athletic events we choose to enjoy at events such as the Olympics. And we also see it in how it plays out in disease and quality of life. As we saw just now, the nature of fatigue in the severe domain of exercise demands that exercise tolerance is somewhere between 2 and 30 minutes, depending on how close you are to critical power. It wasn't until the 15th Olympiad in 720 BC that an event arrived that fell into this domain, which was somewhere between 4 and 9 kilometers of running. At the 65th Olympiad in 520 BC, a further event was added, which was to run either 400 or 800 meters with full armor. In the modern day Olympics, the athletic running events are dominated by the severe domain, with the 800 meters, 1,500, 5,000 meters, 10,000 meters, and don't forget the 3,000 meter steeplechase, all undertaken in this severe domain of exercise. And hence, for this oldest and purest form of athletic endeavor, running, society unwittingly celebrates the severe domain of exercise, described by this curvilinear relationship between tolerance and exercise intensity, and above that which can be sustained in the steady state. It would, however, be remiss of me to ignore the marathon, unarguably the most well-known athletic event. Now, which domain you complete the marathon in very much depends on how fast you can do it. For what you might regard as recreational athletes, running 4 hours and above, this will be conducted in the moderate domain below the lactate threshold. The domain where empires were formed and prey was hunted. Now, life gets more interesting for the fitter club runners, if you like. Here, when you get down toward 3 hours and beyond, for good club runners, the event is completed in the heavy domain, the hinterland between the lactate threshold and the critical speed. And I say critical speed because when we are talking about running, we have to use critical speed rather than critical power. The severe domain appears out of reach for this event. However, in raising the possibility of running the marathon in under 2 hours, as has been achieved in recent years, you have to ask the question of, can we push the physiology that bit further? Well, a few years ago, a paper was published, and in this paper, they took data from 25,000 athletes who were uploading their information to the popular social network for athletes, Strava. From the training data, the authors estimated the critical speed and then compared that to the speed undertaken in a marathon that these athletes eventually undertook. For our recreational athletes, running outside of 4 hours, the marathon is completed around about 80% of the critical speed. As we move through to our faster club runners, we get closer to our critical speed, but we appear to top out at about 92% of the critical speed being possible for those undertaking the marathon in around about 2.5 hours. But when you're trying to break the 2-hour barrier for the marathon, you need data from the best athletes in the world, not 2.5-hour plodders. So in a separate analysis, Professors Andy Jones and Annie Van Hatelo from the University of Exeter provided the insights on elite performance in the marathon. They took a selection of the best athletes, the best endurance athletes in the world, and estimated their critical speed from best performances at shorter distances. They then compared that with the speed at which their best marathon was undertaken. The result for the best athletes in the world is that the marathon is undertaken at 96% of the critical speed. And so for me, this draws into sharp relief how the physiological threshold described by the critical speed draws a line in the sand on what is possible. No amount of desire or enhanced psychology is going to enable an athlete to run faster than their critical speed for 2 hours or so. And hence, for this blue ribband event of running, for elite athletes, it's fascinating to me that they operate on the very cusp of what they can manage in the steady state, hovering just below that threshold where a cascade of fatigue would bring about intolerance in short order. The only way the 2-hour marathon will be achieved, therefore, is to raise the critical speed sufficiently. And so far, this is only achieved by developing super shoes, which propelled Eliud Kipchoge, pictured here in white, to the sub-2-hour mark in Vienna a few years ago. The trainers are combined with this very precise pacing formation that you can see that shielded the wind from Kipchoge as far as possible. The crucial thing to recognize with this event is that Kipchoge was not a better athlete that day. His physiology was unchanged. What Nike and Ineos did was simply change that relationship between the physiology and the running speed through trainers and through the pacing formation and one or two other factors. Now, the significance of this curvilinear relationship between exercise intensity and duration has a crucial role to play in our society when we consider disease. The capacity to tolerate exercise is inextricably linked with the quality of life. If some activity of everyday living is not tolerable, then it will simply be avoided to avoid the discomfort of getting to that point of intolerance. And hence the individual will withdraw from that social activity, withdraw from life somewhat, become housebound, and that has significant consequences for the individual and therefore society as a whole. Now, we have really good information on the energetic requirements, the metabolic rate of a wide range of everyday activities. Here expressed, again, as milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per minute. Simply standing requires a metabolic rate of about 5 or 6 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. Playing a simple game of snooker or pool is about a 50% increase on that, to about 8 or 9. House cleaning, housework, is approximately double the metabolic rate of standing, around about 11 or 12, and walking around about 16. Now, if an individual's critical metabolic rate is below the requirements for any of those activities, they will not be sustainable. And then the individual will simply avoid them all round to avoid the associated discomfort. You might think it's crazy that these simple everyday activities would be unsustainable by people in our society. However, if we look at disease, and in particular I'm going to look at chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, where most of the evidence is, it has been documented that the critical metabolic rate is around about here, 14 or 15 or so, lower than is required for sustainable walking. More worryingly, in a study I conducted here in Liverpool at University Hospital Aintree, the critical metabolic rate was around about 8, barely what is required to play a simple game of snooker or pool. And so you see, the role of critical power in shaping elite exercise performance is of interest, but its role in dictating quality of life in disease is more important. All of this raises the question about how and why we have evolved with these distinct thresholds of physiological function that dictate our exercise tolerance. This we don't entirely know, but I'd like to finish with some contemporary thinking on this, which means it's time for our final physiology lesson. The clues arise when you consider oxygen uptake during the transitional phase from rest to exercise, rather than once the exercise has been established. We know this phase as oxygen uptake kinetics. My colleagues will be disappointed it has taken me this long to say that phrase. In young, healthy individuals, this kinetic phase is around about 2 minutes, as shown here. However, in disease or aging or very inactive populations, this kinetic phase can be up to 4 or 5 minutes. We quantify oxygen uptake kinetics by the parameter T, being therefore around about 30 seconds for our young, healthy individuals, and around about 50 to 70 seconds in disease or aging or severely inactive populations. All of this is important because a slow rise in oxygen uptake has to be paid for. And the way in which the body pays is by using alternative systems of energy for exercise, but ones that accumulate fatigue. Now, this is okay for our young, healthy populations because they only accumulate a small amount of fatigue on transition to exercise. But in disease, for the same exercise intensity, with very slow oxygen uptake kinetics, we get a very significant accumulation of fatigue. And so, in these populations, to manage and mitigate this accumulation of fatigue, we need to lower the exercise intensity to make up for these very slow oxygen uptake kinetics. Now, critical power is the exercise intensity beyond which this fatigue accumulates uncontrollably. And it was therefore proposed that the very fast oxygen uptake kinetics in our young healthy individuals dictate a high critical power, but crucially, the very slow oxygen uptake kinetics in our diseased populations dictates a low critical power. The evidence for this was initially somewhat circumstantial. Here was a cross-sectional analysis by Professor Harry Rossiter of UCLA, taking data across trained individuals, active young, healthy elderly, and patients with COPD. And what we see is a general inverse relationship between critical power on the vertical axis and the parameter T, representing the speed of oxygen uptake kinetics, on the horizontal axis. And so critical power was highest in the trained athletes and lowest in the COPD patients, and the speed of oxygen uptake kinetics was fastest in our trained individuals and slowest in our patients with COPD. However, as the adage goes, a correlation does not equal cause and effect. And we therefore undertook a series of investigations with my then PhD student, Dr. Richie Goulding, alongside my esteemed colleague, Dr. Denise Roche, where we manipulated oxygen uptake kinetics and observed the effect on critical power. We did this in a number of ways, and here's just one example. And in this example, we altered the way the exercise transition was undertaken by splitting it in half. At the bottom, you see the condition where we split the exercise transition in half, and that produces a value of T, in this case of 37 seconds, being effectively relatively slow. When the exercise transition occurs all in one go, the value of T is much lower, which demonstrates a much faster oxygen uptake kinetics. And these were in young, healthy individuals. And we demonstrated quite clearly that when we slowed the oxygen uptake kinetics acutely, we decreased the critical power. Now, we confirmed this result in a number of different ways and ultimately demonstrated for the first time that a faster transition to exercise, faster oxygen uptake kinetics, equals a higher critical power. Now, remarkably, when you extend this sort of analysis to the animal kingdom, you see that the relationship between oxygen uptake kinetics, here with the parameter T on the horizontal axis, and critical power, here on the vertical axis, remains, although in curvilinear form, from the lungless salamander and the ghost crab with the slowest oxygen uptake kinetics and the lowest critical power, to the thoroughbred horse with the fastest oxygen uptake kinetics and the highest critical power. The implications of our findings are easily most important for those diseased populations, since their very slow transition to exercise, indicated in red, dictates a low critical power. And a low critical power dictates a very poor ability to sustain activities of everyday living, which has an obvious consequence for aspects of quality of life. And so our findings provide a strong steer that the search for therapies to enhance quality of life in disease should start with the rest to exercise transition. So bounded by the threshold behavior of our physiology, the capacity of humans to tolerate exercise has had profound effects on our evolution, development, history, and culture. And whilst I imagine we will always celebrate the achievements of our greatest athletes, perhaps the next notable contribution to society of our understanding of exercise tolerance will be its role in shaping healthcare. And that is where I shall finish. It's a privilege. Oh, sorry, Professor Spiller. It's a privilege to stand up here before friends, family, esteemed colleagues, because you never really do anything by yourself. So thanks must go to my family, particularly my wife, who agreed to marry me whilst I was still doing my PhD, and then went through with it. She keeps me grounded. My children, who have to listen to it all and sat through it tonight, although I think Holly read a book. There'll be a test later. I was fortunate to have parents that allowed me to find my own path, and they supported me unequivocally in all of my choices in sport and education. Now, my mum died before I had even finished my PhD. However, when I announced I was going to do a PhD, she responded with, "Oh, you're going to be a professor." Now, I don't know whether this was a question, a statement, or even disappointment, because she really always wanted me to be a medic. Anyway, about 22 years later from that conversation, here we are. I have to recognise Mr. Alan Woodbridge, my old friend and former PE teacher, who introduced me to the subject of sports science. And it wasn't possible to have a more motivating and stimulating teacher. And he always believed in me, in my sport, and in my education. I'm blessed with a fantastic team here in the School of Health and Sports Sciences, which is important because you absolutely don't manage anything without the support from colleagues. But don't tell them I said that, because they'll get complacent. My head of school, Omid, backed me without hesitation when I was unsure of going for this, so I can't thank him enough. So big thanks to Omid. I'd like to thank the PhD students who I've supervised along the way. The best bit of this job is talking research with PhD students. Thank you to the Vice-Chancellor and the institution who believed in me from the moment I sat daunted in front of Dr. Penny Horn for my first interview for a 7-month part-time post, and then I just kind of never left. And thank you to Dr. Kathy Walsh, who kept me right in those very early days. And now she's our registrar. Nothing really has changed on that note. And thank you all for coming along to listen to me, especially those who've travelled from outside the university. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So thank you, Vice-Chancellor. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to respond to Professor Marwood's professorial lecture today. I would like to start with a few words about sport and exercise science in general, as exercise physiology obviously falls under its big umbrella. Sport and exercise science has massively advanced over the last 2 decades to become an important multidisciplinary field in terms of teaching, research, and practice. Sport and exercise science is a hugely important part of the UK economy, as Sport England has estimated that sport-related activity generates £20.3 billion per year for English economy alone, creating more than 400,000 jobs. Within its traditional boundaries, sport and exercise science is a well-defined interdisciplinary area comprising exercise physiology, sport biomechanics, physical activity and health, and sport psychology. By its very nature, sport and exercise science brings together scholars, scientists, researchers, and professional bodies with diverse expertise and interests to undertake research into the science of human physical activity and health. It's also important to differentiate between sport and exercise aspects of sport and exercise science, what we call SES in brief. The sport component focuses on examination of sport performance, coaching, officiating, and impact of sport on the nation. The exercise component principally investigates the positive and preventative impact of exercise on physical and mental health conditions, inactivity, obesity, diabetes, age-related frailty, depression, to name a few. Hence, the exercise component is profoundly linked to health outcomes in human. Exercise physiology investigates fundamental mechanisms of living to enhance training strategies, reduce impact of our injuries, and develop safe and effective health interventions. And more importantly, provide a scientific base for maximizing human functioning and performance in both health and disease. Professor Marwood took us through an extended trajectory of facts and advancements in general human physiology first, and presented a comprehensive historical lesson in exercise physiology. Being really honest, I have to admit that I really enjoyed a bit about James Bond, because I'm really a big fan of that. I should say actually Bond, James Bond. Thanks for putting that moment in your slides, Simon. As we heard from Professor Marwood today, the role of exercise physiology and interconnected research, such as critical power and oxygen uptake in kinetics, has increasingly become a potential concept in the assessment, training, and rehabilitation of athletes, as well as patients suffering from chronic conditions and poor quality of life. Professor Marwood guided us quite orderly, though, through key interrelated exercise physiology concepts, such as exercise intensity, lactate threshold, human fatigue and its impact on performance, exercise tolerance, energy metabolism, and the relation between power and duration, and finally, oxygen uptake, and made us wait for nearly 50 minutes to finally spell out what it's all about. What I understood is about creating a balanced increase in the critical power in line with principles of oxygen uptake kinetics. I hope I'm right, otherwise I'm sure he'll will politely and quietly correct me in due course, not today, of course. The concept of critical power has been in the core of Professor Marwood's research over the past several years, leading to multiple research outputs of highest quality. Professor Marwood is recognized nationally and internationally for his research in this fast-growing aspect of exercise physiology. Today's lecture also unraveled the vital role of critical power in enhancing human performance beyond these days accepted boundaries in human performance. It delivered the message that completing a marathon under 2 hours will eventually happen if I'm right, but definitely not due to high-tech running shoes or human shield, to overcome natural barriers, but due to practical advancements in employing the critical power safely to improve humans' fatigue threshold and exercise tolerance. The lecture also reinforced the potential practical applications of the critical power in optimizing athletic training as well as improving the quality of life for individuals enduring chronic disease, particularly age-related conditions, heart failure, and respiratory disease where the oxygen transport is markedly compromised. Professor Marwood's research has so far provided some strong insights for translating the key findings into health interventions for aforementioned diseased and aging populations. I'm confident, though, that Professor Marwood has already established well-thought plans to advance with his research, potentially involving patients of different groups with reduced endurance and declined physical and functional capacity in collaboration with potential healthcare providers. In fact, reading a few papers in preparation for this response, I myself could see a strong pathways for some collaborations that I will still discuss with Professor Marwood. I've always admired him for being an ambitious, knowledgeable, committed, and professional colleague, and offer my warmest congratulations for this excellent achievement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kayat. I almost forgot to let the head of health sciences respond, so thanks for reminding me. It's good to hear you speak. And of course, you're very proud of your school, as we all are, and the terrific work you're doing. Professor Marwood, if you'd come forward and take this as a little token of tonight. Your mother's words, so you're going to be a professor, was very moving, and of course she was right, wasn't she? Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask your wife to join you, Simon, and probably if you could go first, and then we'll come out to the door and greet you. Thank you very much.